Yes, my mic is working. So again, let me welcome everyone, all of you who are here in the room, and also all the people who are following this discussion at our annual meetings online. So this session is about Ukraine's accession to the European Union. But of course, Ukraine is not the only country which would like to enter the EU, and several countries in the Western Balkans have been waiting for decades with progress with their accession. So while we will focus on Ukraine, we also will briefly discuss Western Balkan countries, their progress and prospects. So my name is Zsolt Darvas. I'm a senior fellow at Bruegel, and I'm really honored and delighted to be here and chair this very distinguished panel in which we aim to hopefully offer some insights on how the accession process is ongoing and what are the prospects. So let me briefly introduce my speakers in the order I would like to ask them to speak. So I would first ask Mr. Gert Jan Koopman, who is the Director General of the European Commission Neighborhood and Enlargement Negotiations. I mean, you have this position since January this year, and before that you had many other positions, including at the EU budget, when you also helped to establish the macro financial assistance program for Ukraine. So I would like to ask you to offer European view, I would say, or a view from the European Commission on how the current accession process is at what stage that we are currently. And then I would like to ask Ambassador Chenshov Velvovold, if I hope I did not pronounce your name too badly.
Almost.
Who is the Ukrainian ambassador here in the European Union. And I would like to ask you to offer how you see from the side of Ukraine the accession process of your country. Next, I would like to ask Maria Repko, who is the Deputy Executive Director from the Center of Economic Strategy in Kyiv, Ukraine, to give a more, I would say, independent or analyst view on the accession process. And last but not least, I will ask Milana Mihailovic, who is the Program Director at the European Policy Center in Belgrade in Serbia, to offer a view from the Western Balkans. But before giving you the floor, let me offer some introducing remarks. Namely that in the past, the accession process was typically a very slow process. For example, in 2003, 6 Western Balkan countries got a commitment from the EU to join, and so far only Croatia has joined from that group. Or Western Macedonia had to wait for 17 years until the candidate status has been granted, and still the country is waiting for negotiations to start. The situation in Ukraine is certainly absolutely unique, because Russian aggression against the country in early 2022 made such a geopolitical situation which was unprecedented. 5 days after the aggression, Ukraine submitted its EU application bid, and just in a few months in the summer, the European Council endorsed Ukraine's candidate status, which was a really fast process. But if we look at, I would say, the applicant countries which would like to enter the EU, and let's say compare how Ukraine ranks in terms of, let's say, the quality of governance or corruption or rule of law and other things, then we find that at least before the war started, Ukraine ranked relatively poorly. I mean, there are a couple of research papers showing that it was either the last or close to the last, or in the midfield of other applicant countries. So in terms of preparedness to join the EU, Ukraine, did not had a good record, at least before the war. Now, lots of things happened since the war started, and certainly the EU enlargement was also in the past a very effective tool in fostering domestic institutional reforms. So we also hopes that this is going to happen in Ukraine. Nevertheless, any projections or timeline on accession, I think, should be evaluated very, very cautiously. Even if President Charles Michel just last week signaled that by 2030 the EU should be ready to admit new members. So given this background, again, I would like to ask initially the four panelists here, just give a not too long view of how they see the current accession process is at what stage we are. For example, in the case of Ukraine, what is needed to start accession negotiations. And also, I mean, with Mr. Mihailovic, I would like to ask her view about the Western Balkan countries more generally. So, Gertha, Jan, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Ezolt. Good afternoon to everyone here. It's a huge question you put there on the table, so I'm going to be brief. Let me make a very obvious statement. I think the Russian war of aggression against Ukraine and Ukraine's wish to join the EU has completely transformed enlargement. Enlargement is back. It's not so long ago that a former president of the Commission made it very clear that enlargement was not to be in the near future. And that's a very different world compared to where we are today. It's also true to say that Ukraine itself is making enormous efforts, starting from a position which, for obvious reasons, is quite far away from where an EU member state needs to be. But the energy that is invested in the enlargement process is very impressive, especially if one considers that this is a country at war. I've been to Ukraine several times since I took up office, and negotiations are stopped because there is an attack on Kiev and you need to go to the shelters. My colleagues who were there last time around spent, I think, 6 out of 7 nights in a shelter. But this doesn't stop the enlargement process, doesn't stop the energy in the country. And I think everyone recognizes that that is really truly unprecedented, and therefore, in a way, the process in the East is igniting dynamism that we haven't seen for a long time. It's not like that, to be fair, in the Western Balkans, but it offers an opportunity to the Western Balkans, and I think that is very important. Now, we need to know, of course, where we are, comparatively speaking. The big question that leaders will need to address in December is whether to decide to open the negotiations with Ukraine. The Commission has set out 7 steps that are well defined, and those 7 steps need to be fulfilled in addition to a number of horizontal conditions to which I think Ukraine, which Ukraine I think fulfills, such as democracy and all that, in order to be able to open the accession negotiations. I think in normal times, it would be very hard to imagine a country doing all of that in the space of just a year. But you saw our oral update in June. A lot of progress was made. A lot remains to be done. That is normal. And I can tell you that work continued right through the summer and is ongoing at full force. I'm sure my friend the ambassador will say more about what's happening in Kiev, but it is very clear that the country sees the accession process as central to its national identity. And that we haven't felt for a long time in the process, and that gives me reason for optimism that they will actually continue to bridge the gap and get close. So it's no secret that we hope that they will get there. It's for them to do it. We can't do it for them. But if they get there, then I think it is likely that we will propose to open accession negotiations. Now, if we look at the Western Balkans, as I have already said, we were not very keen in the EU for a long time to move forward very rapidly, but it's also fair to say that the process in the Western Balkans was slow, that reforms were not advancing anywhere near as fast as in Ukraine. And traveling there in the region in May, it struck me that there is a degree of, one colleague said cynicism. I think that is maybe too strong a word, but despondency or an emotion that you could qualify in different terms is definitely on full display. So the enlargement process needs to be reignited. The energy needs to be reignited. Commission President has tabled an ambitious growth plan, which actually sets out 4 central pillars to dynamize the whole enlargement process and to accelerate reforms, whilst also giving some of the economic benefits to the countries before they join the EU. I sincerely hope that the countries will seize this opportunity. We are in very close touch with all of them. For that, they need to put some of the bilateral disputes behind them. They need to, sorry, that's me. They need to also fully focus in a forward-looking manner on these matters, and that requires stepping up the efforts. So all in all, enlargement is back. We live in a world that is incomparably different to the world we were living in a few years ago. And I think that much as that brings challenges to all of us, it is also really an opportunity for our continent, I would say, not just for the EU as an institution, but for our continent to unite. Because at the end of the day, the way we live in Europe, broadly defined, is very, very attractive. I think we need to recognize this, look at the migration flows to Europe, and we need to protect that, we need to integrate it and take it forward. So there is a lot to play for, you would say, in American football, I guess. Thank you.
Thank you very much for this, I would say, hopeful introduction, which is hopeful in a sense both for Ukraine and also for Western Balkan countries. Because indeed, I mean, if the enlargement process can accelerate, that can create a dynamics, not just what you described, which is currently present in Ukraine, but also hopefully in other parts in Western Balkan countries. Now, Mr. Ambassador, let me again ask you, I mean, the question from your side, from the Ukrainian side. So how do you see your country's aspiration to become a member of the EU? How do you see the requirements which are needed to start the negotiations? But perhaps even more importantly, I mean, the enormous task which lies ahead to fulfill all the requirements, all the 35 chapters of the accession negotiations after they started.
Thank you very much, first of all, for invitation, and good evening to everybody. I think for Ukraine, EU integration, it's much bigger than accession process itself. I think EU as an idea, European institutions, Brussels, I'm not Dmitro Kuleba, I cannot pretend. So this, you cannot find a country where EU is so popular, like in Ukraine. So for Ukraine, Europe, European Union is a symbol. It's a symbol of normality. It's a symbol of development. It's a symbol of rule of law, democracy, whatever. And in the context of Russian aggression, it's also became a symbol of our survival, existential struggle of Ukraine, and departing from the post-Soviet reality, which is promoted by today's Moscow's regime, and it's a sense of direction. So it's much bigger, with all respect to the important recommendations, conditionalities. It's much bigger. The second point is that, unfortunately, it was Russia historically pushing Ukraine to reform. This is the irony of the situation. I spent quite a lot of time dealing with first energy crisis, first crisis back in 2005-6, then second one 2009, then Maidan, and now it's a war situation. And it has been always Russia trying to embrace Ukraine and to create a little Russia, little corrupted authoritarian Russia out of Ukraine. And Ukraine struggle to get out of this bear hug. And until very recent situation, EU was reacting. And what changed with this war, EU is finally in the driving seat. And EU finally considering Ukraine not just as a victim of the aggression, which is true, we are a victim of this aggression, but as an asset. And it's not just, at least as we see it, it's not just a political decision, a favor for Ukraine to help in this difficult situation, but it's also a logical decision based on the economic reality, because even in spite of this war today, Ukraine is delivering. We have functional sectors of the economy, sometimes even causing some challenges to the EU counterparts. We are talking about agricultural sector, we are talking about IT sector and others, but also it's about functioning Ukrainian government. And this is a phenomenon. And it's not only that Ukraine now learning from the EU, and we have a lot to learn, and we have a huge homework, as Gert-Jan just mentioned, and we are working on that, and I'm sure we will deliver in the coming weeks and months to qualify to get into the next stage. But also EU can learn from Ukraine something.
Thank you very much. I mean, indeed, a few months ago, I listened to the presentation of Ukraine's finance minister, who focused on economic issues, but it was really, I mean, inspiring that he showed that, I mean, even though there was a huge attack and the collapse of GDP last year, even the government was able to gain control of its finances, try to rebuild, for example, also on the damaged energy infrastructure to a large extent, and the country was able to and continue to function, which I think is really remarkable. And certainly, I mean, it's a great news that the EU is very popular in Ukraine. Now, Ms. Repko, let me ask you again from a Ukrainian perspective, but more a kind of an analyst perspective. So how you view your country's EU accession bid?
Yeah, thank you very much for having me here and for asking this question. I was prepared actually to talk on technicalities and these 7 steps which your commission outlined as a necessity, but I guess that's maybe a bit too technical for this panel, and I just really want from my heart to thank you for your words about the European aspiration as the part of Ukrainian national identity. And what I want to outline for the audience, maybe not all of you know about that, but Kiev city, it was founded by Scandinavians. Donetsk city, which is the farther east city which was captured by Russia back in 2014, it was founded by the British citizen John Hughes. Mariupol city, which I mean, a lot of you, if you are here on listening to this panel, you know what Mariupol is and where it is situated, and this Azovstal battle, famous one. So Mariupol has a huge Greek community. Greece citizens were living and moving in Mariupol. So Ukraine is not only a country which aspires to be in the European Union. It is actually a part of Europe, right? But this part of Europe, it was during the Soviet times, yeah, part of Ukraine was just occupied by Soviet Russia, and it was the part which was Polish. So if any one of you is interested in this story, I encourage you to listen to Timothy Snyder's Yale course on Ukrainian history. It's really good. So coming back to our issue. First, what I wanted to mention is this seven steps, 7 criteria. We would really be happy to be able to open negotiations as soon as December this year. I mean, this is super challenging. Everyone understands this, but this is what our government is now working on, and the parliament as well. I am not sure that we will be successful. Like, I still have this probability of not completing all this stuff, but I am pretty optimistic. And on these criteria, what are they? First, the Constitutional Court judges selection, it's already done, right? The law is adopted, the selection is in process. Second, the High Qualification Commission of Judges, so it's also a work that was already done in June 1st. This was actually provided. Then further fight against the top-level corruption, and I would say that our anti-corruption institutions are doing not only just a good job, but sometimes they go for even overkill with their activity to fight the top-level corruption. So some of these are good developments, some are probably not so good, and this is where I guess the EU might want to pay attention to this, because when I was in Balkans, for example, many people told me about the sort of witch hunt which was performed by their anti-corruption institutions during these early years of the accession. I don't know if it's true or not, but in Ukraine, we see this as a risk, right? So I'm not with the government, I can talk freely. Yes, we see this as a risk. So please pay attention to that. Also, the fourth point was the anti-money laundering and FATF criteria's completion. We also had a lot of draft laws prepared and regulations adopted, and here I guess the progress is really, really good. Anti-oligarch law, it was passed. The media buyer's reputation, like everything here, I guess, is under control, and the work is going on jointly with the European Commission and the Venice Commission. The 6th criteria was the media law that was passed successfully again, and the 7th and the last one is the legal framework for minorities, and Ukraine as the country was, which values freedom hugely. Actually, in our central square, there is a big board which writes "Freedom is our religion," right? And this is one of the key values in our country. So we value people's freedoms, minority freedoms, but here the question of Russian language is, of course, really painful for us. So here, I guess, some compromise might be looked after. Let's say we might want to discuss some compromise here and to find a common ground. What I was also willing to say is what goes beyond the 7 steps, right? Because the 7 steps, they are the beginning. This December, or I don't know, the next June or whatever, we will. I have no doubts we will fulfill them. But what expects us further down the road? First, it's the common trade policy in the European Union, and we already see that, for example, in agriculture, Ukraine and different countries, the neighboring countries, they might have some issues, and if we address them early as parties who willingly enter into the dialogue to reach a win-win scenario, right? So we might then avoid the negative scenario under which these member states go more and more, let's say, unsatisfied with what is going on, and it might complicate the further enlargement process, given that the European Union has this voting system and so on. So I would suggest that probably we will be happy to see the dialogue facilitated by the European Commission between Ukraine and the other member states on these common trade and agricultural policies and like this. The second point, which I would love to see the dialogue about, I mean, I know this is a bit controversial, that's staged accession, and my like first probably priority concerns people movement, because there are a lot of refugees currently in Europe, and we are super grateful to all of you who accepted Ukrainians, who helped them from the Ukrainian-Polish border to their new homes, and for those of you who accepted them in maybe in your houses, and this is invaluable. What we are seeing now, that many of Ukrainians are just afraid to come back home because they will lose this temporary protection status. And they don't know if Russia will destroy their town or village tomorrow or not, right? And if they lose this protection status, they cannot come back. So this is one of the decision-making points why they are staying in the EU, while they might be already home and actually adding to Ukrainian economy, consumption, and activity in general. And my third and last point is that from the European Union, from European Commission, from like Bruegel as well, thank you, all the elements of technical assistance and advice are crucial, and the increase of the capacity of the government is crucial, people capacity as well. This is the public administration reform, this is the different projects which are aimed at helping Ukraine to create really strong institutions. I was reading about Afghanistan, for example, and there the aid, the huge amount of money which flow from the United States, from the other countries to rebuild Afghanistan. And as far as this paper went, there was no effort to build institutional capacity within the Afghanistan government. And there were even some activities that undermined the trust of Afghan people to their own government, like they wanted to surpass some actions and so on. So by not building these capacities, they did not succeeded in achieving their goals. In Ukraine, to build capacity is super important, because Ukrainians in coming decades, this is my strong belief, that Russia, if it exists, it does not stop, right? It didn't stop after it got Crimea, it didn't stop after it got Donbass, it just still goes on and on and on. So I believe that several decades probably we will have to face this threat of renewed aggression. And Ukraine has to have citizens, people, men and women, who are ready to fight for their country and also trust their government to help them in this fight. So building government capacities, public administration reform, increasing salaries for public servants, I guess this is one of the key areas where European Union can help. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much for walking through the 7 main steps and also the 3 main further steps you would like to see. I think a crucial issue is indeed how to build strong institutions. And in the second round, I might ask you, in fact, all of you, on how to ensure that whenever a law is passed, one thing is passing a law, but another issue is whether that will indeed change how the public institutions and various levels of governments working. But this is for the next round. Now, Ms. Mihailovic, so now I would like to focus on the Western Balkans. And I mean, when I talk to representatives from Western Balkans recent days, then I see, I mean, very mixed feelings from them, because certainly on the one hand, they fully acknowledge that, I mean, this unprecedented Russian aggression against this full-scale invasion against Ukraine created such a situation which certainly justified speeding up the talks between the EU and Ukraine. But also I have the impression that some people in the region feel that now most of the attention is indeed on Ukraine, and the Western Balkan countries. In the past received rather mixed messages, of course some encouragement, but the process was very, very slow. So how do you see from, from the perspective of your region the enlargement prospect of these countries?
Well, I think I can build on what Mr. Kopman mentioned about this, cynicism or whatever we call it, which has unfortunately become omnipresent in the region, in some countries more pronounced than in others. And obviously, in the case of North Macedonia, for example, which has already once been sidelined from the process because simply the unilateral requests which were at that time being made by Greece led to political and democratic stagnation and backsliding in that country, then Macedonians managed to restore the pro-European enthusiasm in their country, and then they ran into another obstacle, again with Bulgarian veto and Bulgarian unilateral requests. North Macedonia is just the most flagrant example of this, but we have had many such examples around the region, and certainly the period of the Juncker's Commission that Mr. Kopman referred to did reduce the overall enthusiasm for the reforms, for the accession process across the region. And I think that, for example, in Serbia, in my own country, many of us pro-Europeans, European enthusiasts, we ask ourselves, how did we get here again? How did we again get to a situation that we have as semi-authoritarian or even, more and more openly authoritarian regime, less and less democracy, less and less rule of law, more and more state capture? And of course, it is not only the fault of the EU, but the fact is that this slowdown and, let's say, reduction of the priority that was given, political priority that was given to enlargement in the mid-2000s, it has contributed to this kind of negative scenarios which have played out in the region. The situation which we have nowadays is summarized on the graph, which you can see here, and which shows how the different countries in the region are currently prepared across clusters for EU membership. This is all based on the Commission's assessments, which are made annually. For cluster 1, we only had to use external indicators for the area of functioning of democratic institutions, because this is the only area in the enlargement package in the Commission's reports which is not provided an assessment of preparedness for membership. And here you can see clearly that in terms of preparedness, we have 3 front runners, which are Serbia, North Macedonia, and Montenegro. Then we have Albania somewhere in the middle, and Bosnia and Herzegovina and Kosovo as falling a bit behind in terms of preparedness across the clusters. I would just say here that although it seems that Serbia might be ahead of North Macedonia, the fact that Macedonia is doing better on cluster 1 actually gives it an advantage, because cluster 1 constitutes all the most difficult and politically sensitive reforms. So I believe that North Macedonia actually would be able, if given proper political support, it would be able to advance much faster towards membership than Serbia because of better standing in cluster 1. Now, that said, obviously, it seems that not all of the countries would be ready to advance very fast on the EU accession path, but the story about the extreme enthusiasm which Ukrainian administration and government now have only portrays and shows that when there is a clear perspective, when there is a drive also on the EU side, that can mobilize the internal resources in a country, even when they're extremely scarce. And I can only imagine how scarce they can be, they might be in Ukraine right now. So this means that if the EU provides the right incentives and the right perspective, real perspective of membership, I think that most of the countries in the region would be able to make fast advances. We had the example of Slovakia back in the late 1990s, which managed, after they overthrew Mečiar's government, to catch up very quickly with the rest of the Central Eastern European region. So that shows that when there is a drive, there is the possibility to speed up the process. And in that context, I think that the speech of European Council's President Charles Michel during the Bled conference, where he proposed that by 2030 the European Union should prepare itself for the next enlargement, sends the right signal. Of course, it has to be supported and backed up properly by member states. It would be good also if it were supported properly by the European Commission, which in a way distanced itself publicly from this speech, but giving some sort of a target year, not as a promise year. And nobody, even in the region, in Serbia, I was called by media, I spoke several times on TV, and there have been many discussions about this. Nobody is seeing this as a promise year. Everybody sees it exactly as it was stated, a target year towards which everybody should work. And this is how mobilization of internal resources, of the capacities of the administration also works. This would be a target year for also our governments to plan their national programs for the adoption of the acquis, to properly allocate the resources, human resources, but also financial resources, in order to fulfill the criteria for membership by 2030, or if somebody wants to be a member by 2030, then at least by 2028 they would need to complete accession negotiations. So in that context, I think that it would be extremely important for the EU now to speak with one voice, not to send dissonant messages, and to be firm about this commitment that it will prepare itself in budget terms, in institutional terms, for the next enlargement. I will stop here, but I will just mention that maybe in the next round I can mention how our proposal on staged accession can help the EU enlarge even before it finishes its internal reforms. And I think that that is where the key is, because we have heard many statements by high EU and member state officials saying that the EU needs to reform and prepare itself for enlargement. But we are also aware that internal reform of the EU is a very hard and very long process. And the proposal which we have made actually gives the answer of how enlargement can proceed even while the EU institutional reforms are ongoing.
Yeah, thanks very much. Indeed, in the next round, I would like you to come back to this proposal. Now, just let me say to all of you who are here, I mean, in the last minutes we will have Q&A, but also everyone online. Just please go to Slido, type #Ukraine and type a question. So I have a tablet here in which I will monitor the incoming questions. But let me have first, before a quick second round. So Mr. Koopman, basically I would like to ask two questions. One is that how the possible outcomes of the war might influence the accession process, because certainly I hope that not in the distant future there will be a peace treaty which will indeed secure Ukraine's territorial integrity. But we cannot exclude that this will be a long-lasting process, either without any peace treaty or a frozen conflict and something like that. And one question is how that could interplay or infer or hinder the process of accession. And the second one is reconstruction. I mean, there are lots of donor countries who already came together and signaled they are ready to help Ukraine in various ways. And obviously, due to its geographical closeness, both the European institution states and also European private companies are supposed to have a major role in the reconstruction. But but it also requires at the same time that if, for example, financial resources are used for reconstructing Ukraine, that it should be spent well, and I mean all the problems with corruption would be addressed before this actually happens. So the second question is how, I mean, the reconstruction could interplay with the accession process and Ukraine's internal reforms.
Thank you. Well, the first question is one that is keeping a lot of people busy. I would say that obviously we will need to look at the realities on the ground, and that will play in the back of many people's minds. But I tend to take a fairly upbeat perspective on that. Look at Cyprus. It's a country that is divided. There is essentially, I would say, a cold peace. It's not ideal, but I think that is something people should look at when we talk about Ukraine. And I certainly would wish that we deny Russia the possibility of preempting European integration by continuing aggression against Ukraine. So it's a challenge, but there are many workarounds. Now, on reconstruction and enlargement, I mean, these two are joined at the hip. Let me explain why. I think without a prosperous or a prospering dynamic economy in Ukraine, the challenges of integration are going to be very big. And conversely, it's very hard to see how the country can really be rebuilt also by the private sector unless there is clarity about where it belongs economically speaking. So they're very closely linked. And in fact, if I talk to business people, they always talk about enlargement. If you go to Washington, D.C., I mean, it's quite surprising, no, that you meet with a U.S. Chamber of Business, they talk about enlargement. Because not because they have political views about it, but because from a business perspective, this is essential. So the two are really closely linked. And that's why, in a way, the high pace, the fast pace, I should say, apologies, that Ukraine is making on reforms for enlargement is also very good news for reconstruction. On reconstruction, what Ukraine needs is an economic strategy that looks through and beyond the war, that everyone can subscribe to, because a lot of money is going to be needed for reconstruction and reforms. And in fact, that's what the Commission has proposed through the so-called Ukraine facility, the 50 billion euro successor over 4 years to the MFA to which you're referred. Ukraine is working very hard on this economic plan. Actually, I kicked off those discussions in July. Teams were working right through August. And the good news is that there's a lot of interest in the donor community in that plan, as we call it, or economic strategy is maybe a better word. So that Ukraine sets out a cogent, integrated economic strategy to which everyone subscribes, so that different donors are not going to be asking different things from a country. You can only have one economic strategy. You can't have an economic strategy for every donor, and that is, I think, the key task now of the donor coordination platform that was set up by the G7, which I co-chair together with actually the Deputy Prime Minister of Ukraine, Mr. Kubrakov, and Mike Pyle from the White House. It's a really important task. We'll be meeting, incidentally, here in Brussels later this month to discuss that. Now, the fight against corruption, of course, in this context is absolutely central. It's already one of the 7 steps. It's the one where it's very clear we need to be extremely demanding, and it is very demanding for Ukraine, given the starting point. But equally, it's a huge opportunity for the country to make a giant leap forward, which ultimately is in the benefit of the country itself, and I would go a step further, is actually a necessity for reconstruction, because you're not going to be investing as a private company a huge amounts of money in an environment where you don't know whether your property rights are going to be respected. And I think that is well understood by my interlocutors. It's a huge transformation, and I think others are better placed as Ukrainians to speak about that, but I draw inspiration from the pace of progress there, and let me be very clear, that will be essential for all the donors going forward. Thank you.
Yes, I can't agree more with you. Just let me add another factor in which you also rightly referred to business interest. Yeah. I think it also very much interplays with the security situation. Yeah. Because in Central Europe in 2004, lots of private money came into these countries that joined it that year, which certainly also helped the modernization and the convergence of these countries. But in Ukraine, if the war or the security situation will be shaky, that might reduce the inflowing foreign direct investment, for example. Now, Mr. Ambassador, again the same question to you. So reconstruction, enlargement, and what you can do that all this money will be spent really properly.
First of all, regarding the scenarios, right? Because indeed there are some commentators just project what if there is a frozen conflict? What if we will need to sacrifice territories, so on and so forth. My answer is very simple. Don't be afraid to defeat Russia. And what is really happening now on the ground? We are advancing on the east, on the south. We defending and advancing on the east. And 1 year ago it was impossible. What was impossible yesterday is possible today. And it is really discouraging then EU leaders say, okay, we don't want a regime change. This is music to the Putin ear when somebody says we don't want a regime change. You need to want a regime change because Russian criminal regime, it's a challenge not only to Ukraine, to Europe, to European Union, to its own people. So especially to those for those who consider Russian people somebody to get back to business as usual in the future, they need to understand that it will be only possible with normal democratic Russia, but not with this regime. And it's a big illusion that we can just freeze, sign, and continue as nothing happened. Because Ukrainian people, they will not accept that type of arrangement. And it is really important to understand this, because Russia must pay. First of all, we are talking about moral obligation of the Russian people, because they also share this responsibility in the historical perspective. And it's also important to our friends and partners to share this burden, because Gertjan mentioned 50 billion, and if we continue like that with our budget deficit, it's just to cover budget deficit, even less than if we're talking about 4-year perspective. So we need those money to kickstart Ukrainian economy, but we will need investment. And it is difficult to imagine how to invest in the country which neighbor aggressive, dangerous criminal regime. So we need to consider the situation in complex, in geopolitical terms, and once again, not be shy. Regarding how Ukraine will guarantee that those money will be spent in the proper way, yes, it is a huge responsibility. And when we are talking about remaining five steps, the justice reform, also constitutional reform, anti-oligarch exercise, anti-corruption agencies, it's all about anti-corruption, and it's connected to the reconstruction effort. But I think the most important element here, Ukrainian people, and I'm sure 100% will not tolerate corruption. They are able to defend their country outside. They're able to fight the aggressor, and they will be able to defend their interests inside Ukraine.
Deep thoughts, Mr. Ambassador. In fact, again, one encouraging information I obtained, your colleague finance minister, is that the tax paying, not capacity but willingness has increased since the war started, because before that people might try to avoid taxes, and now they understand that, look, our home is under attack, and we need to contribute. So
yes, it's trust to the government.
Yeah, so all my praises indeed to the Ukrainian people who go through these very difficult times.
Absolutely.
Now, our time is getting very, very short. And we also have a couple of questions I would like to. So Ms. Rabko, if you can just answer one of your questions in 1 minute. So how to build strong institutions in Ukraine that you raised in your earlier, but please try to be very, very brief.
This is a good question. We asked this question, I think, in 2016 in a big panel to leading world brains like Timothy Snyder and others. There is no silver bullet. You have to just step by step build trust, build expertise, and of course you have to try to retain these people with trust and expertise, right? So if I may just make a short comment on one of these EU rules that should be implemented into our legislation. One of them is to make the politically exposed person status to last till the end of the person's life, right? So this is one of the examples why Ukrainian people from business do not want to go to politics at all. Why there is a very small cohort of those who are ready to sacrifice all their personal life for all the years to come, and their families, which will also struggle with this IML at every bank, unable to open an account, to run the firm, and so on and so forth, just for the rest of their lives. This is one of the examples of why people do not go to politics in Ukraine, because there is a huge amount of risks to be prosecuted, to be prosecuted for the corruption, to be prosecuted for not the corruption, but just for some wrong decision, and so on and so forth. And at the same time, to be super accountable, filling all these forms and so on. So I guess what Ukraine lacks and what everyone lacks is the respect for people, right? For people's dignity, not just for the citizens, but also for those who are in the public service. This is one of my important points, and I hope that you will understand that.
Thanks very much. Now, very quickly, Ms. Mihailovic, if you can just very briefly explore your idea of stage accession, also how the process should be changed.
Let me see if I have mastered my elevator pitch. Can somebody just put on the slide with the scheme, with the stages? I see it on the screen here. So if you can just put it up, I will start speaking. So this is a proposal that was developed by us from CEB Belgrade together with Center for European Policy Studies here in Brussels already in October 2021. And we have just republished a revised version of this proposal, which is also taking into consideration the prospects for Ukraine and Moldova and potentially also Georgia. And it does propose also that it would be a suitable way forward for these countries. Why? First of all, this proposal offers more predictability in the process of accession. This is one of its key objectives, and it does so by specifying clearly what the countries need to achieve in terms of preparedness for membership in order to access specific pre-accession benefits, mostly in terms of substantially increased financial support, through IPA, through pre-accession funds, and secondly, through gaining access, controlled and selective access to the work of the EU institutions in observer status. I won't go into all the reasons why that is important. The former for the closing of the socioeconomic convergence gap between the region and the EU, and the latter for the socialization and for practicing what EU accession, what EU membership actually means, and etc. In addition to predictability, this proposal also aims to unlock political will on both sides, both on the sides of the candidates and of the EU. For the candidates, this would mean that basically achievement of these substantially increased incentives would hopefully mobilize political will for the difficult reforms in the countries, in the pre-accession countries. And we are speaking about substantial increases in financial support, but merit-based. This is the key word. It has to be merit-based. And on the other side, in order to harness and to galvanize political will among member states, especially those that are more enlargement skeptical, the proposal introduces a transitional third stage, which is the moment when new member states actually become members, but through through the accession treaties, through the acts of accession, there are specified limitations for a transitional period of 10 years in which the newcomers would not be able to exercise their veto powers in the council. They would be able to participate in all the discussions, to vote on all qualified majority voting, but they would not be able to impose a veto when major EU decisions are made. This also has a positive spillover on the situation in which, for example, one candidate reaches the EU before its neighbor, and then it would not be able to block its neighbor's accession process, which was also hinted by Charles Michel recently. The other most important limitation, or let's say special regime, which we are proposing, is to prolong the already existent safeguard clauses in the accession treaties, which give the Commission the possibility to withdraw or to freeze some of the rights of membership in case that a new member state breaches the Article 2 values, fundamental values of the EU. And that should help the EU also use this additional time, these additional 10 years, to finalize its internal reforms, while the candidates would not have to wait for these internal reforms to be finalized. The fourth stage occurs automatically after the expiration of the transitional periods, and of course our assumption is that the EU would indeed use this kind of a grace period that would be given by these transitional measures, this transitional period, to finalize and to strengthen its internal control mechanisms when it comes to fundamental values, rule of law, democracy, but also improve the internal decision-making processes by extending the use of qualified majority voting and reducing the use of unanimity in decision-making in the Council.
Thank you so much. It was, you did a great job. You did a great job, and indeed, even some of the questions online already touched the issues, namely the unanimity voting and what to do with that. But let me open first the floor for some questions here. The gentleman in the second row already indicated that he would like to ask a question. If anyone else would like, please raise your hand so that I know to whom the mic should be given. Next.
One with us and the other one.
So please briefly introduce yourself.
Yeah, thanks. It's Jeremy Fleming from Euronews. Gertjan, you said interestingly that the Ukraine situation and its position opens doors for the Western Balkans. But I wondered what sort of assessment you have of popular support for Russia in the war in Serbia, and what impact that would have on the perspective for enlargement.
Well, I don't want to go too much into detail on Serbia, but what I see is, and I think everyone can see that, is that Serbia is actually, as part of the accession process, moving away from Russia and moving closer to the EU. A very practical example is the requirement that is covered by the accession process to unbundle the energy system and to effectively link up its energy system with the rest of the Western Balkans and the EU, in this case, for example, with Bulgaria. That's very important because it's very hard to decouple politically from Russia if your energy system is completely reliant on Russia. So that's an example. I think I'd leave it to you as a Serbian to say a few words about how you see the situation in terms of evolution. But my own observation is that there is a realization in the Western Balkans, in all 6 countries, that being very close to Russia is not necessarily such a brilliant idea, and people are redoing the calculus, the political calculus.
Thank you very much. There's a question, Jakub, up there. No, but for the online audience, it's important to have.
Thank you. But there's been Jacob Kierkegaard from the Peterson Institute and GMF. There's been a lot of talk about the sort of institutional reforms that the EU needs to make to facilitate enlargement. But I guess maybe I can ask you, Gert-Jan, also to put on your previous hat. Now, there is a specific issue that comes up for renewal in 2027, namely the upcoming EU budget. And I mean, right now we're going through a rather shameful exercise of some EU members blocking Ukrainian grain, etc. And it's kind of difficult to not see that as kind of a precursor for what might happen when the same member states might be forced to lose some of the support they get from the current EU budget as the EU budget prepares for a likely Ukrainian accession. So I guess my question to you is, to what extent do we need to see real fundamental reform of the next MFF in order to have a reasonable time frame for a Ukrainian EU accession?
Thank you, Jakob.
Yeah, but please
sorry.
wait. Is there any other question here? Yeah, one more maybe. If we collect a few questions and then we have a last round in which each of you will have an opportunity to respond briefly.
Thank you, Lars Holgaard, formerly with the Commission, now with Trade Up. Accession, I don't see how that is conceivable without a reform of our institutions. I mean, we cannot repeat the experience of Poland and Hungary. There is a need for the protection of the EU and its democracy, its defense of democracy, that the independence of the judiciary, independence of the press, and so forth, all those are essential if we're to have another accession. Thank you.
Thank you. Any other question? Yeah.
Hi, Stanley Peñal from The Economist. Just to complete the two previous questions, there's going to be a problem with the budget. There's going to be a problem potentially with fundamental rights. What are some of the other issues that we need to think about in terms of this absorption capacity? For example, the number of commissioners, for example, vetoes, and all these other questions that occupy Brussels probably more than they occupy people in the Western Balkans and in Ukraine.
Thank you. Indeed, I mean, some of the online questions also very much related to that. For example, Francesco Nicoli, who is, I think, also sitting here, noted that the majority voting might need to be changed, which might require a treaty change. Someone else also mentioned that already within 27 members, it's often very difficult to build a consensus and how to reform the EU. So indeed, on the side of the EU, there are also, I mean, very pressing issues. I'm not sure how you are able to answer all of these questions, but I would like to give the chance of all of you for briefly responding to whatever you want, or just giving some closing word. Maybe Milena, if you could first.
Well, I can maybe refer to the necessity for the reform of the EU institutions. It is clear that this will be a long process, but it is a process that is already starting and that is already being heavily discussed. We have also the Franco-German working group, which is working on proposals, etc. So the wheels are already in motion. The main question is whether the candidates for accession will have to wait until this process is over in order to accede or not. And since this is going to be a lengthy process, I really believe that making the candidates wait for the end of this process would again reduce the enthusiasm, and it could potentially also reduce the enthusiasm even in the new candidates, even in Ukraine and Moldova, in case that this is prolonged for another 5 to 10 years. So this is again where this transitional period, which we have proposed through our model, and which is fully based on the accession treaties. Accession treaties are internationally, in terms of international public law, on a par with the founding treaties. So while they cannot indefinitely change the provisions of the founding treaties, they can stipulate specifics and transitional periods, and this is nothing new. With every accession treaty, there were specific transitional periods. For example, candidates were often obtaining having 10-year-long transitional periods for the application of the very costly environmental acquis, environmental directives. At the same time, in the period of seven years after accession, the workers from the Central and Eastern European countries were not able to seek employment in several EU member states' labor markets. So these transitional periods are already part of the acquis, they're part of EU law, and what we have proposed is basically to curtail some of the rights of the newcomers. One of the proposals initially was also to for the newcomers not to have a right to nominate a commissioner, because obviously, you know, a commission with 30-something commissioners would probably be quite a difficult place to work. But we already have the Lisbon provisions, which should be implemented, and with the right political support and with the right political incentives, it would be the most logical solution, simply to move towards the rotation system. And the other part of our proposal with the prolonged safeguard clauses would actually help the EU get additional time to further develop its internal mechanisms, such as the rule of law monitoring mechanism, which is already in place, the conditionality regulation, which has already brought a lot of change in terms of how member states are made accountable for lack of rule of law and quality of their institutions when it comes to spending money, and etc., etc. So the EU is already working on developing these internal mechanisms, and with this kind of an approach, it would get additional 10 years from the date of entry of the first newcomer in order to complete these reforms.
Yeah. Sounds very sensible.
And without the need to change the existing treaties, that is the most important.
Maria, please.
Okay, I'm obviously not in a position to comment on the EU reforms, but what I could say is Ukraine's willingness to join the EU and to go through all these transformations, including every democracy and fundamental right and every possible issues which we might face. The thing is that for Ukraine, joining the EU is a sort of the existential choice now. We already tried to stay with Russia. We don't like that, right? So it doesn't work. It doesn't work for Ukraine. It doesn't work for us. And we have no option now of staying in a gray zone, which we tried to do for so many years. We will, like Ukraine will be turned into Belarus, which is now from its territory acts as a proxy Russia, shelling Ukrainian territory. And I'm sure that no one wants Ukraine to be turned into such a gray zone. So this is the choice for us. And obviously the choice will be the European Union.
Indeed. Gertja, please.
Well, I'm not going to comment on what Milena said, but there are many interesting ideas. And actually, if you zoom out a little bit, they build on existing mechanisms. And I think that's very important. And we should not fall into the trap of abusing the what is called here in the bubble the absorption capacity issue to come to the conclusion that enlargement is not going to happen anytime soon because it's simply too difficult for us. I think that's objectively speaking, if you look at it historically and empirically, simply something that can be accommodated with existing mechanisms. Now we are talking about 9 countries potentially. So to do that one by one might actually be a little bit complicated. It's not excluded. And that's why the debate about reforming the enlargement process is there, and ideas such as Milena's and others are out there. I also think it's important to distinguish between the budget, your question, and the institutional reforms. I mean, the budget is always a nasty discussion. It is not pretty. It's good that it's not so public because it's soul-destroying exercise, I can tell you from my previous job. But we always manage to arrive at an agreement. I'm very confident, incidentally, that we will get the 50 billion. Everyone is unhappy, but that's the way it works, right? And enlargement is going to cost the budget. Yes, it will cost the budget. And there are 2 ways of dealing it. In simple terms, either you make the budget a little bit bigger. The budget is very small. It's smaller now, about 20% as a percentage of GNI than it was 20 years ago. Or you reform the policies, which is very hard. Member states can make the choice. We have our ideas in the Commission. I'm sure we'll make proposals. But I don't think the budget issue should be transformed into some sort of monster that will, a Cerberus, that will protect in the wrong sense of the word against enlargement. I think on the internal reforms, there are many things. I mean, you refer to the Lisbon Treaty. I mean, the number of commissioners is not something that is laid down in the EU treaties in a way that cannot be solved. It's actually, it's actually doable if there's political will to do it. So, yes, this debate is there. It is relevant because we're looking at so many countries that are relatively poor joining potentially relatively soon. But honestly speaking, I belong to the furniture of Brussels. I've been seeing so many of these debates. This is not something that is beyond us in terms of the necessary adjustments. So I think this wonderful debate about absorption capacity and enlargement, we need to solve the absorption capacity issue first, because otherwise enlargement will fail. That's not a relevant debate. I think the issue that was raised, I can't actually see because of the lights by the colleague who was sitting there, about making sure that the EU is protected, that the system functions well. That is really a very important issue. That's an important issue for the 27, and it will also be a very important issue eventually for the 36. But it is not an issue of enlargement per se. It's an issue we have today. Thank you.
Thanks so much. And Mr. Ambassador, the final word is yours.
Oh, thank you very much. I will not comment on the EU reform. It's for us what is important, but also it's relevant that we can benefit from participation in the internal market and relevant EU policies on the way to the final goal, which is membership. It is important to keep the level of motivation high within the Ukrainian society for Ukrainian economic operators. And as an example, I can just mention the trade autonomous measures which Ukraine now is benefiting from. It's a great support for Ukraine, and even during the war, we are increasing our trade with the EU. Yes, you can say it's because it's decreasing on Russia to zero with some members of the Eurasian so-called economic zone for obvious reasons, but this is a matter of fact. Our relations, in spite of the war, are getting deeper, more solid, more complex, and economic operators already benefiting from that.
Thank you so much. And with these words, my last job is just to ask you to join me in thanking the four panelists for this very insightful discussion. Thank you.